What would Furious 7 have been like had Paul Walker not tragically passed away? With shooting only about halfway done at the time of Walker's death, the filmmakers were forced to change the ending to the movie. But what's talked about less is the fact that his death also altered the direction of the franchise and subsequent sequels, which would have seen the return of past villains looking to team up to take Dom and Brian's crew down, while also potentially introducing us to Brian's father. So let's dive in and take a look at what happened behind the scenes and also find out what could have been Furious 7. Paul Walker's history with the Fast and Furious franchise is a complicated one. While filming The Skulls, the movie's director, Rob Cohen, and producer Neil Moritz asked Walker what he wanted to do next, to which he replied that he either wanted to play an undercover cop like Donnie Brasco or race cars like in Days of Thunder. A few months later, Rob and Neil would come back to him with a Vibe magazine article about underground street racing and suggested the movie follow Walker as an undercover cop tasked with infiltrating that world, partly inspired by the 1991 film Point Break. Like the Fast and the Furious, Point Break features an undercover cop infiltrating a group of extreme sports enthusiasts who commit daring crimes to fund their lifestyle. Even the restaurant Neptune's Net, which appears in Point Break and is a real restaurant located on the Pacific Coast Highway in Malibu, California, also makes an appearance in the Fast and the Furious. Regardless, not only did Cohen and Moritz still need to turn the idea into a script, but they needed a green light from the studio, who told them they'd give it to them if they could get Timothy Olyphant to play Dominic Toretto. Olyphant, however, would turn them down, as he had just appeared in Gone in 60 Seconds and didn't want to repeat himself with a similar film. As a backup, they turned to Vin Diesel, who had gained recognition for his supporting roles in Saving Private Ryan and Boiler Room, and for his lead role in Pitch Black. And while Vin was sold on the idea, he hated the script, leading David Ayer to be hired to rewrite it, as he changed it from a mostly white and suburban story set in New York City to a diverse one set in Los Angeles, to reflect the LA he grew up in. However, the filmmakers still needed a title, unsatisfied with the working title Redline, or the title of the article the film was partly inspired by, Racer X, or other alternative titles they came up with, such as Race Wars and Street Wars. Eventually, producer Neil Moritz discovered the 1954 Roger Corman B movie called The Fast and the Furious, and traded Corman some stock footage in exchange for a license to use the title. After the film's enormous success, Vin Diesel turned down reprising his role in the sequel, dissatisfied with the script as he felt it didn't live up to the first movie. Ironically, he also didn't want to taint the first film, worried any sequels would hurt its chances of becoming a classic. And while Walker would star in the second film, the studio decided to go younger for Tokyo Drift and brought in a whole new cast. However, when that film tested poorly, the studio asked Walker to return for a cameo at the end of the film, which Walker would refuse to do as he was mourning the loss of his grandfather at the time, resulting in the studio turning to Vin Diesel instead. Diesel, in an incredibly shrewd move, agreed to do it for free in return for the ownership rights to the Chronicles of Riddick franchise. Additionally, by returning, Diesel also gained more control over the future direction of the Fast and Furious franchise, which is something Walker could have had he returned, especially considering the entire franchise was originally created for him. When Walker was approached about returning for the fourth movie, he balked at it, feeling the franchise had grown stale, but he'd eventually be convinced after a phone call from Diesel, who promised it would be the last one, which of course it wasn't, leading Walker to eventually ask director Justin Lin to kill off his character. Over the years, Walker would develop a love-hate relationship with the franchise. While he loved the fans and making the movies, he also grew tired of basically making the same movie each time. However, Fast 5 would mark a radical departure from the franchise's street racing roots. Feeling the racing aspect had put a ceiling on the number of people willing to go see the films, the studio wanted to broaden their appeal and take the series out of the car culture and into the world of heist movies that had car chases like The Italian Job and Gone in 60 Seconds. Writer Chris Morgan developed an idea while penning the previous film that involved stealing a large safe, but that film's premise didn't really work with how Morgan envisioned the heist. Luckily for him, the studio's mandate for taking the series in a new action-oriented direction would be the perfect opportunity to finally put his idea to film. By the time Furious 7 rolled around, director Justin Lin, who had helmed movies 3 through 6, departed the franchise, leading Walker to be unsure about returning. And while he leaned towards not coming back, after talking to Lin's replacement, James Wan, the two hit it off, resulting in Walker returning. Unfortunately, with about half the movie shot, Walker would tragically pass away in a car crash. Most of the scenes he had shot were action scenes, with the actor not having yet filmed many of the other dramatic, dialogue-driven scenes, which would now be impossible to get. After reworking the script, the filmmakers used Walker's brothers, but replaced their faces with CG versions of Walker. Other shots were taken from outtakes or older footage of Walker, which were then relit and repurposed for use in the film. And while everyone's familiar with the ending to the film, the original ending would have taken place at the Neptune's Net, as the crew hands over the God's Eye to the Secretary of Defense. After the Secretary of Defense leaves, Hobbs asks Dom what he's going to do now, and if he plans to rebuild his house. Dom laments that for the last 10 years, he and his crew have wanted nothing more than to fit in and lead normal lives, but that's just not who they are. Brian echoes this sentiment, saying how he can't get used to the minivan, as the crew tells Hobbs that they're going to be outlaws again and return to their life of crime. We then cut to the car of the Secretary of Defense, who goes to demonstrate how the God's Eye works for the cabinet who are watching via satellite video feed. As the Secretary pops in the USB, a music video featuring Roman begins to play, as the motorcade turns around and races back to the Neptune's Net. Inside, Dom crushes the real God's Eye under his boot, saying that nobody should have something this powerful. As the crew wonders where to go next, they let fate decide by throwing a knife at a world map on the wall. When the Secretary of Defense returns, they find the team already gone, as we cut to Dom and Brian's team racing away. The movie would have bookended with a post-credits scene right out of a comic book movie, as their own version of the Sinister Six would have been assembled by Cypher to take down Dom and Brian's crew. Their group is made up of Johnny Tran, the leader of the Vietnamese biker gang from the original film, Carter Verone, the Miami drug lord from Too Fast, Too Furious, Arturo Braga, the leader of the Mexican cartel from Fast and Furious, ZZ from the Rio gang in Fast 5, and finally Shaw, who would have escaped the rubble at the end of the film and not been arrested like in the final version. And while Tran looked dead at the end of the first movie, Brian does tell a bystander to call 911 as he runs off, suggesting that Tran could still have a pulse. And considering how ridiculous the Fast and Furious universe is, that's totally believable. This post-credits scene would have set up the following movie, which would have presented Dom and Brian's crew with an Avengers-level threat. However, when Paul Walker passed away, director James Wan and writer Chris Morgan felt it was more important to pay tribute to Walker rather than set up the next movie. As a result, Morgan rewrote the ending as a way to give audiences a cathartic experience so they could say goodbye to the late actor. The studio, to their credit, agreed. The change to the ending of Furious 7 and Walker's death not only altered plans for the sequel, but also shaped its thematic core, as Morgan felt the 8th film, The Fate of the Furious, should be about loss, resulting in the idea to make Dom the antagonist. By doing this, the team feels lost, as they lose the foundation of their lives, while they also struggle to understand Dom's betrayal. This emotional turmoil mirrored the real-life grief of not only losing Walker, but the uncertainty and fear of continuing the franchise without him. Thus, the film became a cathartic exploration of dealing with grief, emphasizing that enduring loss can ultimately lead to strength and rediscovering joy. And speaking of sequels, the seeds were planted in Fast 5 for Brian's father to appear in a sequel, as Brian mentions that he doesn't remember anything about him or even what he looked like. There's a long-standing rumor that Mr. Nobody, with his mysterious background, was originally meant to be Brian's father. His role as a covert government operative would explain his absence during Brian's upbringing, as well as why Brian doesn't recognize him as an adult. However, regardless of whether Brian's father was meant to be Mr. Nobody or a new character altogether, his reintroduction into Brian's life would create a profound internal conflict for him. His dad's presence would remind him that by continuing to live life as an outlaw, he risks repeating his father's mistakes if he gets incarcerated, which would leave his own son to grow up without a father just as he did. And this is the internal struggle the writer saw Brian grappling with in subsequent sequels. As a father with a young growing family, Brian misses the thrill of adventure, while also grappling with the fact that going on those adventures puts his life and freedom on the line. And while in the finished film he comes to understand that family is what truly matters and chooses to prioritize them, in the original version Brian would have realized that he didn't necessarily have to make a choice between the two, as his character would have continued to try to balance both in subsequent films. There were a few other differences between the original version of Furious 7 and what we got. In the original, Letty would have had more flashbacks as she fights to regain her memories, including one where she learns that she was pregnant with Dom's child, which she miscarried when she was almost killed. The emotional toll of losing the child is what led to her memory loss and inability to return to normal life. At the end of the film, as she cradles Dom's unconscious body, she would have told him that there's one memory Dom never shared with her, and that's because he didn't know about it, before proceeding to tell him about her miscarriage. Sean from Tokyo Drift would have been in the movie a lot more too, and would have been the one who drifts to catch Brian jumping off the bus instead of Letty. Hector would have made an appearance in the third act as well, playing a small part helping out the crew. Although the Fast and Furious franchise was originally created as a starring vehicle for Paul Walker, his true legacy is that it's grown beyond him, evolving into a global phenomenon that continues to thrive. But at its heart, the franchise still carries his spirit. A reminder that even in his absence, the family he helped build lives on. Thanks for watching, everybody, and don't forget to like and subscribe to Bullets and Blockbusters for more great content.